Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Typhoon called Offerings. Oh, I'm not going to make any fans of this particular review. And part of it really starts off with an observation about the increased commercialization of indie rock. Because there really is two distinct schools of it nowadays. Stay with me, I'm going to get to my point here. You've got the rough scrabble upstarts where if they get any crossover appeal in the mainstream, it pretty much comes by fluke. Where the textures or the vocals or the presentation or the content might be kind of off kilter or abrasive or experimental, but there is something about all of it that sticks. Usually in the fine details of great compositions or smart writing or just a damn solid understanding of their strengths or a fantastic hook. And on the flip side, you've got the indie groups that are flagged as such because they're just quirky enough to not fit on mainstream pop or rock radio, but safe enough to play for your average gentrified afternoon beer run and picnic in the park. I mean, you know the groups. The ones that a decade ago would have been called adult alternative and will be soundtracking comfortable middle-brow sitcoms and commercials for a steady paycheck for the rest of their careers. And you know what? That's not always a bad thing for the record. Hell, I'd probably put The National in this category, and they're a genuinely terrific band even despite that last album, which didn't really work for me. Worked for a bunch of other people, and that's fine. But I always get worried when I start hearing about bands in this vein being branded as experimental or progressive, because more often than not, they're labels used for cheap marketing to disguise pretentiousness or a lack of cohesion, while never being truly challenging work. And you know what? Even then, it can still work as decent music. Look at Elbow and their last album, even though I'd argue they're just more straight progressive rock. But on the flip side, you get acts like Alt J and the group we're discussing today, Typhoon. Now, they broke out of Portland in the very early 2010s, and I can emphatically say I am not a fan of this group. Mostly because they have the sound of a profoundly boring and stuffy group that try to substitute wonky song structures for depth and experimentation in indie rock. Now, some critics tried to compare them to Arcade Fire for their truly massive lineup, and pretty much on just that basis alone. I mean, they got a horns and strings section, but it holds shockingly little water to me. Most because even at Arcade Fire's most pretentious and least earnest, they can at least write a decent hook or have some interesting production with some teeth to it. With Typhoon, it always felt a little bit too clean and sanitized, with the content on records like White Lighter trying to bring more of an edge, but with no clear idea of how to do so in more of the production or composition. Out of nowhere, tempo shifts and transitions don't always make you seem progressive. Without a foundation in the compositional layer, you're just obtuse and not all that interesting as you think you are. So yeah, I'm not really a fan. But apparently their newest album, Offerings, was their most ominous and sonically demanding. So either somebody in the band decided to grow some testicles or a spine, and they had to somehow manage to stick the landing on this 14-track, 70-minute album, or you know what, it was going to be the biggest mess they ever made. So it wound up on my Patreon schedule. What did we get with Encore? Well, I was not expecting this. And I want to make this abundantly clear. For as much contempt as I might have shown towards the group, where honestly I just don't care, I'll state right out of the gate that Offerings is by far their most competent that their compositions have ever been. And thus, I can see why some might be a little bit surprised by me saying that of all of Typhoon's records thus far, this is the one that angers me the most. Because if you're not making the effort to decode the album, you might not have heard it. But I did make the effort, and thus I can make this statement. This is arguably one of the most short-sighted, myopic, and damn near offensive portrayals of memory loss and mental illness that I've heard on an album in a while. And here's the thing. While it is central to why this record does not work at all for me, and if they were a bigger band, they'd be getting a lot more flack for this, I don't quite get the impression the intentions were quite so bad. So instead of giving this record the thorough profanity-laden thrashing that it probably deserves, I'm going to use this as an object lesson to why artistic framing is so damn important, and how good intentions can be undermined by not considering or understanding that. So okay, what is artistic framing? Well, that's somewhat straightforward. It's how, through the art's execution, it is to be perceived by an audience. Now, for the most direct example, Andrew WK wants you to party hard on I Get Wet and have a great time doing it. So, he uses broad power chords, heavily compressed guitars, and basic lyrics to deliver that intention. And what makes that record so damn transcendent is the purity of the experience. It so fully embodies that intention to party hard. That's why it connects so effectively for so many people. It's got that universality. Now, compare this to so many modern trap songs and hip-hop. They want you to turn up and go crazy, same sort of vibe, but the tones are desaturated, focus more in brittle minor keys. The delivery is incoherent or flat, and the content is often how much better they are than you as they take your money, screw your girl, and then kill you. Which is one reason I'm so cold on a lot of that genre. It just doesn't do much for me. Now that's the basics of framing. You want to get a little bit more complicated, look at, say, Melodrama by Lorde, an album describing a relationship that burned out too fast thanks to Lorde's intensity, her partner's distance, youthful naivete, and a sense that all of her expectations will just come to nothing and won't turn out in the end. That's the text, that's the intention of the album, but the subtext, the composition, and the production work to heighten that intimacy, accentuate the rough edges, capture her angst, and draw attention to the melodrama of it all, and the value of that emotionality in teenage life, how it has a certain place. It's one of the reasons why Lana Del Rey's records like Ultraviolet frustrate me so much. The content touches in similar territory of the artist making bad or misguided decisions in love and life, but it's framed as subtle high drama that doesn't fit the text with pretty much zero self-awareness. So okay, why bring all that up? Well, Typhoon on Offerings is looking to explore central ideas surrounding mental illness and memory loss, both from the outsider looking in and the person, the protagonist, experiencing these events. Primary metaphor established very early on is fire, representative of one's life and fueled by human memory, which is the offering made to continue on. Sacrifice the memory of life's experiences to keep on living, with the acceptance of death at the end to whatever afterlife and renewal coming being the thematic endpoint that comes on the hidden track of this project. And if that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, offering your experiences to live longer, and spoilers after you take in the rest of the record, it can read as pretty damn appalling the more you think about it, well, you get the sense it's not really designed to make a lot of sense. As early as the second song, Rorschach, we get lines like, "Reason's a tease," intending to show how our protagonist is questioning his own rational mind, drawing the conclusion that the only thing he can really trust is the fragile strands of memory he holds onto, which on the same song is revealed to be kind of inconclusive as well. And thus the rest of the record is a blurry stream of snapshots and offerings as the protagonist tries to focus on what he knows and remembers, turns on those that he loves, and falls into paranoia and substance abuse before passing into something presumed to be better with some vestige of peace. And let me establish this. Thematically, there's a core here. You can tell that there was at least some desire and thought to show the complexity of a situation like this, particularly emotionally. And yet, it's in the framing and the subtext where this record screws up, and let me start with the lyrics, because as much as this record wants to speak from the perspective of somebody who is losing their memory or their higher faculties, it feels utterly disconnected from the truth of how some person like that would present themselves. And it's right on the very first song. I get the purpose of establishing the protagonist as having lost his memory, being at his lowest point, clinging to whatever he can, and yet even with the complete loss of dignity, would one person in this situation ever say, "I shit the bed in solitude"? It's poetic, isn't it? But that language choice and usage is one of the biggest problems with the record. This is an album that will reference Flowers for Algernon and Harrison Bergeron and Fellini's 8.5 alongside Greek myth and the Bible that wants to present itself as very worldly and intelligent and well-read, but they feel incredibly out of character for how this protagonist, even with all of his allusions to the everyman's wealth brought low, which again reflects a level of privilege I don't want to get into yet, how they would act in a situation like this, it compromises the immersion. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now compare this to Father John Misty, whose choice of language and symbolism is just as pompous, but it's punctured by his own self-awareness of his situation. It actually does get down to a more human and relatable level, even on his most pretentious songs. Or let's go to Brand New on Science Fiction, where Jesse Lacey is so acutely aware of his own fracturing mind and consciousness and his personal neuroses that he holds nothing back in allowing the record to get as ugly as it does in its framing. Now, when Typhoon shows his protagonist getting paranoid or pushing away loved ones on unusual or darker or Ariadne, it pairs it with nihilistic language where you can't ignore the references to modern right-wing political paranoia, where the hell that came from, and that strikes me as not only unnecessary and kind of heavy-handed, but implying a stripping of agency for this person in a really dehumanizing way. And that feels at odds with tracks like Chiaroscuro, where he seems to be nobly accepting of his fate and losing his memory in a way that no person losing their memory would ever feel. If anything, it feels more reminiscent of a very Hollywood picture of mental illness or memory loss, wanting to capture the wistful moments of regret or contemplation of the human condition, or those forgotten that can be beautifully framed and tastefully lit, but never really willing to engage with the angry reality of what it might be, the gross indignities that might be felt, never allowing that person to fully tell their own story, shuffling them off this mortal coil before the uncomfortable realities of the situation are felt. I'm gonna piss off a lot of you by using the word privilege here, but it's incredibly apt when it comes to the framing of this record, choosing just enough of the protagonist's victimhood to create the drama and draw out sympathy from the audience, but never allowing them to become a rational agent in their own lives or story in the text of this record, which not only can feel pretty damn gross, but leaves the emotional connections feeling really hollow. I don't get sucked into this at all. And you know what? That's a damn shame when you consider that this is arguably Typhoon's most well-composed project to date. I'll say it again. Okay, well, to a point. It's definitely their most stable, spare, and dark project to date, which can make its 70-minute runtime kind of draining. We'll come back to that. But to say this record is going to engage with the textures that is more raw or abrasive or experimental, that's asking for something that Typhoon has never done, and unfortunately they don't do here, even if it's appropriate. Part of this is frontman Kyle Morton, who certainly sounds tasteful enough in his Gordon Lightbody impression, but he and Shannon Steele never bring any sense of deep or raw intensity to these songs, outside the heavy-handed Fellini reference that was thoroughly beaten into the ground across the project. And what's more exasperating is that for as big as this band is, you would think they would call upon more members to flesh out their story from alternative perspectives, or at least keep the protagonist's narration somewhat consistent, whereas it seems like Morton is constantly shifting perspectives on some of these songs. Now, I'll at least give the band some credit in probably having their most stable melodic compositions to date at the foundational level, even if they've developed a fondness for lo-fi vocal filters and are placing them midway to the back that isn't nearly as abrasive or challenging as they think that is. But beyond that, and some lingering drone-heavy textures and a few guitar lines that might have a little bit more low-end muscle and bite like on Rorschach, or the thicker bass and guitar on Darker, which really does not get closer to the title, these are not compositions that build a lot of momentum or intensity. Or when you have frenetic solos like on Unusual, they throw in this keening synth over everything before a horn-inspired Latin breakdown with sleigh bells that goes nowhere and fits in with nothing. And then when they do try to do something similar with a thicker low-end build on Bergeron, you get that synth coming back. Now, part of these problems, they also come in the drums. Whoever thought that distorted pickup in the percussion would help the mix, they were just wrong. But another factor comes in Typhoon's stubborn refusal to let go of the more tasteful arranged elements like the strings or the incredibly clean, shimmering guitar tones. I get trying to add some dramatic gravitas, and this would do it, but not only does it not match with all the inorganic vocal layering and sound effects that you patch in, it neuters the sense this record can really pivot into the uncomfortable reality of the situation, which doesn't help the problems in the framing. Now, more often than not, this record relies on very liquid acoustic guitars and lingering keys, or the occasional slapdash bit of lo-fi interjections, which, yeah, can lead to some very pretty moments or pretty sparse moments, but they also spark an easy comparison to progressive rock acts like Steven Wilson or Elbow, or even that last Brand New record, who have done these sounds and similar themes far better and with some actual hooks. Now, the closest thing this record gets to bringing any sort of real power or emotional weight for me comes on the Shannon Steele front track coverings, which is more heavily reliant on strings and seems to be speaking from the observer's point of view for once. Shannon feels like the only real moment where that shift up happens for her, or on songs like Remember or Ariadne with that pretty damn solid guitar melody and the firmer bass groove. Actually, a lot of the bass work on this album is pretty good. I'll give them props for that. But even then, the mix on Ariadne buries the more unstable paranoia of the protagonist behind vocal filters while letting more twinkling melody flutter at the very front. What an apt metaphor for so much of this record. Ugh, look. There is a part of me that feels like I should be so much angrier about this project. It's painfully overlong, there's no significant dramatic weight, the vocals are incredibly underwhelming, and even despite slightly sharper compositions, the writing is pretentious as hell, wanting to impress the audience with all the literary references while treating the story at its core as a prop for semi-coherent ideas about memory and consciousness that make less sense the more you think about them. Appropriate for how much this record disdains reason, considering it falls apart at the seams if it's actually applied to to it. And yet at the same time, with the exception of the utterly unnecessary political commentary that adds pretty much nothing in its parallels, it's all that flattering, the more I plowed through the 74-minute runtime of this record, the less I directly hated it, as it feels like there was at least a seed of an idea here, just a horribly framed execution that badly needed an editor to trim this into something salvageable. I hate the presumptuous attitudes that come from artists who should know better, not taking the time to fully think this through, which bothers me a lot more than the record itself, and thus, like with all Jay's last album ahead of them, it's getting a 4 out of 10 and no chance in hell I'm recommending it. Hope you all learned something throughout this review with regards to artistic framing and how to screw it up in record time, but I'd stay the hell away from Offerings. Granted, I would have said that about anything from Typhoon, having heard their discography, but yeah, applies just as much with this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this review went on long, but I had a lot to say with this one. It was a mess. If you want to buy the record, though, links in the description below, and all you Typhoon fans, I don't know, are there Typhoon fans? You got the polls up there, you can tell me how wrong I am. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. And if you actually want to see the schedule, link to my Instagram, I post it whenever it gets updated. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.